Okay, so welcome, Jojo. Thank you so much for joining me today. This month we've been exploring our relationship with nature through the eco-resolution topics based on the understanding that what we're currently facing is a crisis of relationship, in that it's a crisis in how we come to relate to ourselves, come to relate to each other and the natural world. And so much of environmental issues, I feel, is kind of grounded in this story of separation, this idea that humans aren't inherently related to or connected to the natural world. And perhaps if our culture understood like the inherent interconnection with the natural world, then we wouldn't be seeing the damage that we do today. But it's a real honour to be speaking with you because we can kind of maybe explore this from the perspective of law. So, Jojo, you are the co-founder of the Stop Ecocide campaign, which is an incredible movement, and we'd love to hear about this.
Oh, well, it's such a pleasure to be with you. And I love what you just described, and actually going and looking at your website as well, just really inspired and enthused by how you're portraying this and that whole kind of framing that you're making about the separation and our mindset of separation, because, you know, I'm completely 100% with you on that, that I feel like this is the, you know, this is the fundamental problem that we're facing is actually, it's one of mindset. And, you know, our particular contribution, if you like, as Stop Ecocide, is a very kind of fundamental piece, we believe, in terms of readjusting and rebalancing that, both in our sort of mental concepts, but also, you know, in the way we relate to the world, but also in terms of the actual law of the legal framework of what we're allowed to do and not allowed to do. So, I mean, perhaps I should just sort of start with a very brief kind of description of what it is that we're campaigning for.
Yes, please.
So,
yes, please. Thank you.
Thank you. So our key, we're really, one way of saying it, I like to say we're a bit of a one-trick pony. It's just a very, very good trick. The single thing that we campaign for is to make ecocide, or mass destruction and damage to nature, to make that a crime, to make it an international crime. Now, most people, I believe, when you talk to them, feel in their hearts that mass damage to nature is criminal, but they don't realize that it's not yet a crime in most of the world. And they also don't realize that it could be, and that to make it so is a relatively straightforward process. And so that is what we're campaigning for, is making it illegal. And just as a kind of framework to tie in with your narrative of bringing us into relationship with nature, we believe that criminalizing damage to nature can go a long way to doing that, in the sense that our legal systems are very much focused around people and about hurting other people. And we don't put the same weight on the concept of damaging nature. So, you know, even though there are lots of environmental regulations, it's still not a crime to cause mass damage to nature. And once you put ecocide alongside genocide, i.e. the mass destruction of people and the mass destruction of nature, once you make those things equivalent, there's a kind of shift that starts to happen where people kind of go, my gosh, well, if that is as bad as that, then that must be equal in value. And so there's a, you know, in terms of the intrinsic value, you know, rather than monetary value. So that there's a very kind of fundamental piece we feel in there.
Yeah, thank you so much for that explanation. I think going back to, you know, what you said about it's an issue of mindset, a lot of this. I mean, and I think this is the other aspect of us not making that, like that link with the connection between environmental rights and human rights, and that environmental justice and social justice are inherently interconnected. But we often see these things as like two separate areas. Either you care about humans or you care about animals, and not making these links. And with eco-resolution, we're really trying to foreground the fact that human rights are inherently dependent on the ecosystems, as in on the air we breathe, the water we drink, and the food we eat, the forests that sustain us, the land that we live on, that we inhabit. Like, these are the most fundamental rights of humans, and yet we kind of see environmental issues as like the last thing. I mean, culturally it kind of feels like the last priority for us always. It's kind of focusing on humans first, but yeah, it's just another example of this kind of psychological split that we've created from nature.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I'd love to hear a bit about so like you said before about how law is very human focused. So is that the difference? Is that civil law? So we're trying to shift from civil law to criminal law? Is that the...
I mean, I think that law as a kind of entire framework is very strongly anthropocentric, so focused on humans. But I think that in the context of what we're doing, the difference between civil and criminal law is very important, because there's quite a lot of legal cases being taken around the world now in the context of climate and in the context of the environment. People are suing companies for negligence and for damage and so on. And there are now, probably heading for 1,500 climate litigation cases going on around the world. Now, that's a lot, and it's great that that's happening, and it's great that those companies are being held to account in that way. But there's a reason why that doesn't actually stop the harm from continuing, because corporations ultimately budget for compensations and for these kinds of cases. So if you change environmental regulation, which is where most environmental law sits, so if you say to, if you change the law so that, you can no longer put this many toxins into a river or so on, you can change these regulations. But all that will happen is that the companies will change their budgeting. They won't change their behavior. Whereas if you make a law into a criminal law, in other words, if you make something a crime that an individual person can be responsible for. So that might be the CEO, or it might be the head of operations, or it might be a government minister issuing a permit. Once you start making individuals criminally responsible, you will start to see changes in behavior, because none of those CEOs wants to end up behind bars, and they can't then hide behind their corporation and its financial deep pocket. It's actually a completely different kettle of fish. But the other thing that to look at, I think, in the difference with civil and criminal law is that in our, I say first world, we call it first world, don't we? But in our supposedly advanced culture, what we use to draw the moral line is criminal law. So we use criminal law to say what's acceptable and not acceptable. We don't use civil law for that. So something that might incur a fine doesn't have the same moral weight as something that's established as a crime. So we accept that murder is a crime. It's completely unacceptable. We realize that it still sometimes happens, but it's completely not the norm. You're not allowed to do it, and no business can build their entire corporation around a practice that kills people. That's no longer a legitimate business. I mean, maybe that's the mafia, but it's not a legitimate business. And so you can see that as soon as you move something beneath that red line and you say this is criminal, you actually start to change the moral landscape in a very strong way. I mean, I'll give you a perfect little anecdote just to describe this. Polly Higgins, the amazing UK barrister that I co-founded this campaign with, who's sadly no longer with us, but she interviewed the head of a UK bank a few years ago, and she asked him, why is it that you continue to finance these incredibly destructive activities? And he just looked her straight in the face and said, it's not a crime. Which just shows you that if something's made unlawful, the funds that support it can no longer go in that direction. So that's hugely powerful.
It's so powerful, and it feels kind of so possible, like, because it's such a fundamental thing, and you have such a clear demand, which often in the realms of like environmentalism, it can feel like things are kind of complicated, and in different places they'll have different effects. But I love this because it's just really clean cut, and it really kind of gets right to the point. Can you give me an example of of like how it would come into effect. So because so much of what we consume and it comes from the earth. So how would, do you have any examples of how a corporation would have to change its practices in order to not be having, to not be seen as criminal?
Yes, I mean, I think that it's probably useful in this context to know a little bit about what the procedure is to make this a crime, because that can give you a picture of how things might evolve. So it's the 4-stage process. So to begin with, you just need one state or one head of state to propose this amendment to international law at the International Criminal Court, and that can be any state. So this is one of the things that's really exciting about it, is that we've been working with small Pacific Island states who are the most climate vulnerable in the world, and who can really see the direct correlation, between damage to environment and their own livelihoods and what's happening for them. So they've been the sort of champions of this up till now, and so you just need one state to potentially propose this at the International Criminal Court. The second stage is at the next meeting, when the assembly of the court has to vote that it's prepared to discuss it. Then you need to get to a stage where you have 2/3 of members who agree to it, and finally individual jurisdictions, so individual nations, can start to ratify it and enforce it. Now, why did I give you that description? Because what we're really doing, what we're aiming to do, is to put the entire world on notice. So you may remember when the data protection regulations came in, there was this kind of period where everybody knew that the data protection regulations were going to come in at a certain date. And so they had a certain amount of time to adjust their practices to fit that legislation that was coming in. That's exactly what we're aiming for with this. And it's why I explained the stages, because as soon as a country is prepared to step forward and propose this, and there are a number that have been working with us, and we don't feel it will be too long. We're not, because of COVID, things could be a little bit delayed, but it could be as early as next year. As soon as that happens, it's like it puts the writing on the wall, because what you're then looking at is the concept that all of our practices and all of the whether that goes from fossil fuel extraction to pesticide use to fracking to all of these activities that create mass damage and destruction, they will have to be looking at the way they do what they do and thinking, okay, well, it may take 3 years, 5 years, but this is coming. And so we're going to have to look at different ways of operating. And so our key narrative, if you like, is around putting the world on notice and setting things on course for a different way of doing things. Now, in practice, once that's in place, yes, of course, if a company is continuing to destroy either large areas or long-term or very badly, so widespread, long-term or severe, then yes, their CEOs would potentially be in line to be prosecuted for this. But the whole idea of making sure that people can see this coming is so that you create a kind of automatic transition that allows the world to start operating in a different way. And that's really exciting.
Yeah, it's really brilliant, because what we're seeing at the moment is kind of a lot of government initiated projects to address the climate crisis. It's not actually stopping any practices which are causing the climate crisis, but it's just these little plasters on top of these huge wounds, kind of, like planting like 1 million trees, but like not actually addressing like the fact that it's our waste and consumerism, which is kind of meaning that we're chopping down so many trees. So I'm really excited by the prospect of the Stop Ecocide campaign to really get to the heart of it in a legal way, and also to relieve the people from carrying the burden. The fact that this needs to be such a big campaign when it's actually such a simple thing that all governments could enact just shows how kind of highlights the lack of political will there is. So how is it for the campaign at the moment? What's the progress, and how many countries do you think you'll need to have on board in order for it to go into effect?
So we're in an interesting position at the moment, and the situation with the pandemic has also kind of underlined this in a way. I mean, first, just to update on where we've got to. So we're currently at a stage internationally where the conversation has just moved onto a governmental level. So a few years ago, nobody was even really talking about this. Even last year, if you'd stopped someone on the street and asked them whether they understood the word ecocide, most people wouldn't have known what you were talking about. Whereas now there's at least a chance that anyone you stop will have a good stab and get it right. And so that conversation has changed enormously. And that is a large part down to the civil movements that we've seen. So Greta's Fridays for Future, and of course the Extinction Rebellion, who have brought these words like, our placards were all over the rebellion. So, that whole kind of discourse around ecocide has grown hugely in the last year, and that conversation has expanded. And also, and this is the sort of tragic side of this, is that we've seen obviously such a kind of increase in the awful devastation that is happening, whether it's the Australian bushfires, whether it's fires in the Amazon, whether it's flooding in Indonesia, all of these things that are making people really aware of the scale of the problem that we're dealing with. And of course, the more aware they become of that, for all of those reasons, the more ready they are to hear what we're saying. So it's a kind of it feels very, we always have these kind of mixed emotions, because it's like, we're pleased that people are listening, and we're gutted about why that is. It's been a no-brainer for a decade, but it's only just becoming so for many of the public. So there's been a lot of progress in terms of expanding the global conversation in the media, on the streets. Also, even heads of state, using words like ecocide, which just start to expand that conversation. And then last December at the International Criminal Court, 2 sovereign states, so Vanuatu and the Maldives, both very climate threatened, actually announced in front of all the other states that are members that they thought ecocide should be seriously considered as an addition to international law. So that has really taken the conversation onto a government level. So that's really exciting for us. And we've been working with Vanuatu, for example, for 3.5 years now, and it was so encouraging to see them take that really brave step, and actually announce that publicly. So that's really exciting. So the next step is going to be to get a definition and draft together that is, that works with those states who are willing to move forward with this. And I think to come back to the particular situation we're in now with COVID, there's an interesting political narrative that can now emerge around this, which is very important, because individual governments find it quite scary, the idea of making ecocide a crime. And of course, with many first world governments, we know exactly why that is. They're hand in glove with polluting industries, and they are very, they're quite almost hands tied in terms of what they feel they can do literally overnight. And so most countries on their own would feel quite scared about taking forward a law like this. And we saw this in France last year, where it twice came up in government for discussion and twice got rejected. But then the French president announced that that basically he felt that it should be taken forward at an international level. And that really highlighted a political narrative that's important, which is that if you support this at the international level as a government, it's much lower political risk, because you're not doing it by yourself, you're not sticking your neck out, but you're supporting something that can't go forward unless a lot of people come with you, so it feels safer. But at the same time, it actually allows you to be a leader in that arena. So we're really looking for governments around the world to start realizing that they can really take the lead on this, and be seen to be moving on this, in the knowledge that once this does happen, there'll be so many with them that it won't be scary. It's actually a kind of safety in numbers, if you like. So that is something that's really emerged with the situation with the pandemic, because so many people are talking about, well, we can't go back to business as usual. What do we need to address our ongoing situation? And this is really a sort of key piece in that. And it's I think, if people can think of it at the international level, it becomes much lower political risk and higher political gain.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Thank you. Yes, because I think what I've been reflecting on since the pandemic is the fact that in my lifetime I've never seen international action like there has been for COVID. And I think what has been the low-lying anxiety of mine throughout like the years of engaging with environmental activism is this feeling that like can governments enact such massive changes, and can they do it across the board? And so one positive thing which has come out for me is now knowing that change can happen, and it can happen unanimously, and that kind of governments can take control and kind of, you know, sort of like stop this path of business as usual. So that's been that's been like a good realization since COVID. But when you earlier on you talked about governments kind of having their hands tied because of the relationship between governments and corporations, and am I right in thinking that there's a law that protects corporations in some parts of the world, so that if a government tries to say no to a particular, say it was like a fracking company, if they were to say no, and it would undercut the corporation's profits, that the government could then be sued. Is that correct? And if so, how does Ecocide play into that?
Yes, it is correct, as I understand it, and there are special courts where that could be resolved, and it's very difficult. It's not in public either, which is actually horrific from the point of view of democracy, and the point of view of the rights of humanity and of course the natural world. However, criminal law does trump it does trump civil law. So ironically it could trump in that way. The fact is that the Rome Statute, which is the governing document of the International Criminal Court, it's actually arguably the most powerful legal document in the world, because international criminal law sort of sits at the top of the pyramid, if you like. There's sort of different levels of law. I mean, there's kind of soft law, which is, Paris Agreement is a classic example. Wonderful that everybody's agreed on it, but not enforceable. It's essentially at the level of a treaty, and there's a lot of international environmental treaties. And then at the second level, you've got kind of civil law, which is what tends to protect property and profits. But when you get to the top, you have criminal law, and that really that's ultimately more powerful. So you could have a trade dispute, but if one of the people in that dispute is committing murder, that will, if I say it like that, it becomes quite obvious that is going to become more important than whatever the trade dispute is. And so once you put in law at a criminal level, it does that. It goes beyond those kind of trade laws and international treaties. So yes, it would indeed make a difference in that arena, a big one.
That's great. And is the Stop Ecocide campaign, is it about human rights or earth rights, or both? I mean, is it literally about the earth having rights of its own, or is it more, was it not so much about that?
It's a slightly different arena. I mean, there's quite a global movement now supporting rights for nature, and some countries have accorded rights in their constitutions to nature. Some particular rivers and forests, for example, have been given legal personhood, and so that whole discourse of rights is, if you like, it's one side of the coin. Criminal law is about the responsibilities, so it's literally like two sides of a coin. So if you think about it, our basic human right is the right to life. Okay, so we've all got the right to life, but if it wasn't a crime to murder somebody, your right to life wouldn't really be protected, would it? Because it would be fine to go and just shoot someone. And so for rights to be protected, you have to have a criminal protection that goes with it, which is why criminal law is protective law. So ecocide is, if you like, ecocide is to the rights of nature like murder is to the right to life. It protects the rights of nature. Yeah. So
that makes sense.
Yeah. So it's complementary while not being quite in the same arena.
Thank you. There's this great quote from Polly that I found, Polly Higgins, on online, and it kind of determines ecocide as whether or not inhabitants can peacefully enjoy the territory. And I really love that, just peacefully enjoy, because it kind of reorientates our priorities of what human rights are and how that can be seen from a legal perspective, that it's actually like the right for inhabitants to like live in harmony with the world around them, and the right to enjoy the world. I thought that was really beautiful. I'd love to know how we can support the campaign, about how our listeners can support. I know our co-founder Cara Delevingne is an Earth Protector. I'm an Earth Protector, and you sign up to become one. If you could share, how we can get involved.
Absolutely. Well, the first thing I would say is to go to our website, which is at stopecocide.earth, and absolutely sign up as an Earth Protector. And what you're doing by that is you're sort of nailing your colours to the mast, if you like, because you join our list, which you can search, so you can find your name on it afterwards. You join our list of those who are actively stating, we believe that destruction of nature should be a crime. So you're actually making a rather beautiful statement that you believe that all the creatures on the earth have the right to peaceful enjoyment, and that seriously disturbing that is a crime. So that's one thing. Also, you do so by putting some money in, and it can be as little as a $5, and it can also be, unlike many campaigns, you can just do a one-off donation if you like. I mean, obviously we'd love you to do recurring ones, of course we would, but those funds go directly to supporting the legal advocacy work and the diplomacy, the diplomatic advocacy work that actually takes this forward at the international level. So the beautiful thing about that is that we're all familiar with the way that big corporations have they employ big lobbying firms to kind of do their advocacy for them. It's like this campaign is a bit like the good twin of the evil fossil fuel lobbyists, in the sense that what we're doing is essentially lobbying. It's advocacy work, but it's instead of being paid for by big dirty money, this is being supported by crowdfunding. It's being supported by people like you and me, by people who want to see that change in the world. And as far as we know, that's the first time that's ever been done in terms of a global crowdfund to finance a law, effectively to lobby for a law. And that's a really exciting, kind of empowering thing to be able to do. And I think specifically, and this is something that your website talks about as well, is there are so many millions of people that really want to see these changes, and they really want to see and they want to make a difference, but they feel powerless. So, I mean, this is, a simple, quite small initially thing that people can do to actually know that, a bit of their money and their name is going towards actually changing the legal foundations of what is allowed to happen in the world, so that we're actually protecting the earth for future generations. It's a bit like creating a legal insurance policy, if you like. It's like, if we say, this far and no further, you cannot damage the earth more than a certain degree, it doesn't matter how that damage is carried out. It kind of allows us to deal with any kind of ecocide that someone might dream up in the future. We'd be able to say, look, this far and no further, and that's a really exciting thing to be part of. So we'd love people to come and join us.
Brilliant. Because I mean, Eco Resolution, we're trying to really look at how we can kind of move from tokenistic actions to like transformative action, from behavioural change to systems change, and the relationship between all these aspects. Because and what I love about the Stop Ecocide campaign is that it really gets to the root of the issue, to the systemic point. And last month we were speaking with Annie Leonard, talking about about plastics and fossil fuels and the relationship between the two, and about the importance of us like turning the tap off, so to speak, in that we can be doing all these beach cleanups all the time, but fossil fuel companies are planning on tripling the amount of single-use plastics that there are already in the States. I mean, but it actually gives me goosebumps just saying that out loud. But I think that this is why your campaign is so incredibly beautiful and powerful and exciting, and something that we should all be signing our names to and donating towards, because it really gets to those people, so that we can continue all the grassroots on the ground work, which is so instrumental. But if we're not having that top down change, that can only really be done through legal frameworks, and the future's not going to be as lovely as it could be.
I think that's absolutely right. And I think one of the things that's interesting about what we're doing is people often find it a little tricky to grasp, because they think of it as, it's a lot of people have a feeling around law that's scary. So, they don't necessarily understand that there's lots of different arenas of law, and they don't necessarily understand how that interacts with the rest of their daily lives. And then on top of that, which I think you touched on briefly, is the way that people, it's funny, one of our team actually said to me the other day, the biggest most successful coup for corporate PR is making all of us individually feel responsible for the ecological crisis. And so there's this sense that, yes, we all want to do something, and yes, we all know that we contribute to this footprint, but we also know that the reason we drive fossil fuel cars is because that's what's available to us and cheap, and that's not our decision. That's made at government level, and in terms of policy and industry influence. So this is why it becomes very important, as you say, to go to the top level and to actually forbid certain practices, so that so that effectively the playing field that is open to those big players simply changes. And when it comes down to it, that then gives us the freedom, and it gives everyone who cares about the environment, every single environmental campaign. I mean, whether you want to save the dolphins, whether you want to, protect food resilience, it could be, deforestation campaigns. I mean, everything will all be supported by this law being in place. So the way that we think of it is that, you may have your particular personal thing that really speaks to your heart. It may be a particular animal, it may be a particular landscape, it may be, plastics in the sea that gets you, riled up. It may be any one of those things. But when ecocide law is in place, all of those things you care about will be easier to look after and easier to protect. So it's almost like, it's not an and or, it's an and. It's like, do what makes your heart sing, and support this as well, even if it's just the once off, because what we're doing will support, is that key fundamental piece, that can support all of it.
And it's not the workers, is it, who will be in trouble? It's like it really affects within the corporation or the company. It's at the top, isn't it? It's the CEOs, it's the people making the decisions, not the workers who are working within the corporations.
Absolutely. This is not aimed at end users. It's not aimed at workers. It's aimed by going for it at the International Criminal Court. This is putting it on a level with atrocity crimes, and just like with genocide, where it wouldn't be individual foot soldiers who would be prosecuted, it's the controlling minds. So the same with ecocide, it would be the CEOs, the heads of operations, government ministers issuing permits, those kinds of people who the law is aimed at. Ultimately, as I say, we're not driving fossil fuel cars deliberately to commit ecocide. And interestingly, we also believe that in all likelihood those CEOs are not doing what they're doing deliberately to commit ecocide. And actually, this is a difference between, say, war crimes and genocide, because, if you're committing genocide, you kind of have to be doing it on purpose. Like, you have to be intending to, kill off a race of people or a group of people. Whereas with ecocide, it's nearly always the side effect of simply wanting to make money. So it's a bit different. And it potentially has a power to enforce that's easier, because the International Criminal Court is a court of last resort. So if you pass a law at the International Criminal Court, every country that ratifies that law has to incorporate it into their own criminal justice system. So we have the International Criminal Court Act, where the UK signed on to the original statute, and therefore war crimes, genocide, crimes against humanity are also crimes in the UK. And when something's a crime in your jurisdiction, you can just go report it to the police. There's not a special court you need to go to. It just becomes part of your criminal justice system. And so that's one of the, hugely sort of powerful things about it. But of course, average CEO doesn't want to be in the same bracket as a genocidal maniac. I mean, with corporations, and destruction of nature is essentially a corporate activity generally, corporations depend on public confidence. They depend on their share prices. So they don't want to be seen as evil criminals. That's why we have the whole phenomenon of greenwashing, of people trying to look eco, is because they don't want to be seen as those criminals. So as soon as you put ecocide as a crime on the table, you really start to change how those CEOs are going to start thinking about what they're doing, because that will then put them in a bracket with, you know, the genocidal maniacs of the world, which is the last thing they want.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, it's really about the mindset that we have, isn't it? About like really understanding what the effects of our actions are, and understanding that what we do to the planet, we're doing to ourselves, we're doing to like fellow human beings around the world, and to the future generations as well. I'd love to ask you one last question, a quick question. What book or documentary would you recommend to us and to Eco Resolution community?
Well, I would have to say the book that's just been republished by Polly Higgins, who I co-founded this campaign with, and it's called Dare to Be Great. And it's actually, I mean, she has written legal books about ecocide law as well, but this one is much more accessible in a way to any reader, and it's a kind of inspirational journey book about how she came to be doing what she was doing, and, you know, making her steps towards changing the world in a positive way. And, you know, it's incredibly inspiring and encouraging of everybody who would like to use their own particular skills to make a difference in the world, and maybe start identifying how to do that, because I think that's often something that, you know, people don't quite know where to start. Almost, it's like, how do I bring my gifts? Because I truly believe, as Polly did, that we all have unique gifts, have unique gifts to bring, and that finding out how we can do that to actually help create a better world, I think is something that book is really good at, just kind of eliciting and inspiring in people.
Thank you, Jojo. We're going to add that to our website then, on our resources page, because that sounds perfect. I think that, yes, it's so important for us to think about positive change making not as a kind of sacrifice and something that we need to add on to our lives, but kind of as a means to carving out a life of greater purpose and belonging and connection as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. Couldn't agree more.
Well, thank you so much, Jojo, for your time today, and I will be sure to be sending everyone to the Stop Ecocide website in order to sign up as an Earth Protector, and hopefully start their monthly donations as well to support all the incredible work that you do.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye bye.